given this description of the product life cycles and given the description of the skills that you need to have competitive advantage in each of these phases, the question that we can then ask is where each stage of this production of this life cycle is likely to be located in terms of production facilities. Okay, so against this, to answer this, an answer to this question comes from an author who is Vernon, who actually develops a theory of international production that heavily relies on the product life cycle approach. Vernon was working on Harvard Business School, so he was working in the US. He was highly influenced by Heber, that at that time was working at MIT, which is also placed in Cambridge, Boston. So they of course influenced each other, and both authors started with the same problem. That is, try to make sense of the huge increase of U.S. foreign direct investments after World War II. Now, what is the starting point of Vernon? The starting point is the following. So, given the description of the product life cycle that we saw before, the question that he asks is, where are new ideas and technologies for new product most likely to originate, depending on the skills available in the country? Second, where is the production of new products most likely to be located? And also, what circumstances lead to the location of production abroad, and where and what are the consequences for the flow of foreign direct investments and for international trade? Okay, so given the picture of the product life cycle that we saw before, the question that he asks is, does this tell us anything about where production activities are going to be located around the world, and also what are the implications that this distribution of productive activities around the world have for the analysis of foreign direct investments and international trade? Now, his point is, so having these questions in mind, he starts his theory by recognizing, let me remind that his focus was mainly the US. So he starts his theory by recognizing that the US presents three important characteristics from the economic point of view. First of all, it has consumers with a high average income per capita, so US consumers are relatively rich. Secondly, the US has a very large market, which means that even minority tastes, meaning taste of marginal consumers, represent fairly large markets in absolute term, because of course they are small in terms of the overall markets, but given that the market is very large, they still represent very large market niches, if you want. And finally, it is a market or an economy characterized by abundant capital and scarce labor, and this has an implications with respect to the organization of production activities. Now, let's start with the initial phase of the product life cycle, so the invention phase. Question is, are new products likely to be conceived in the US or more likely to be conceived in the US compared to other countries? Well, the answer is yes. Why? First of all, because in the US you have high income per capita and large differentiated markets, so large market niches, which implies that there are huge opportunities for new products to be sold there. And entrepreneurs are actually, the main activity of an entrepreneur is actually to search for new market opportunity. So US entrepreneurs compared to, for instance, European entrepreneurs are much more likely to spot opportunities for new markets and new products in the US. okay, operating in the US markets. Just because, for a size reason, okay, so US market niches, that is, US, so market niches associated with minority tastes of consumers, these consumers that may be willing to try new products, to show the need for new products. These consumers are much more in the US in absolute terms than in other countries. So from this point of view, US entrepreneurs have an advantage during the invention phase because are much more likely than entrepreneurs operating in other countries to identify these needs and try to satisfy them with new products. So if this is the case, so notice that in Vernon arguments, markets and the characteristics of demand play a much larger role in explaining the introduction of the product rather than skills, okay, of engineers and of scientists. Okay, so Vernon arguments is much more a demand-based story than a supply-based story. Now, we know, however, that this contribution, and later on in his production, Vernon actually does that, he can integrate also this supply-based argument associated with the availability of high-skilled scientists and engineers in the US that could also explain why the invention phase is more likely to be located in this country. Then he moves to the production phase. Now, does this imply that also new products will also be produced in the US? And the answer again is yes. Why? Well, because at the beginning, when you are in the invention phase, products are not standardized. They will be changed several times. So depending on the preferences of the consumers. And in order to do this, to adjust products to the demand of the consumer, you need two things. You need flexibility and freedom to adapt in an easy way the consumer, the characteristics of the product. So in a certain sense, you need consumer to be close to your let's say production departments where engineers and scientists work, in order for this information to flow easily and in a cheap way. So you need scientists and engineers to be close to the consumer in order they can, and also to be flexible enough to be able to adjust the characteristics of the products to the requirements of the consumers. So you need flexibility on one hand from the production point of view, and you also need proximity to the consumers because you need to be able to understand what consumers basically want and demand. Moreover, another important factors that explain why this production can be the initial production phase is likely to be established in the US is the fact that US average consumers are fairly rich, high income per capita, which implies that the elasticity of demand of US consumer with respect to price at the beginning is relatively low, which means that firms should not worry much about the price of new products because a change in price will not affect in a significant way the size of the demand. So, which also creates an advantage because as we know, at the beginning, during the invention phase and during the initial production phase, your costs are very high because you need skilled people, you need advanced knowledge. Oftentimes, you can also make some errors in the way in which you organize your production and the way in which you specify the product characteristics, which imply that your costs increase. So, if you can increase your price to cover this cost, of course, this is an important advantage. And given that this increase in price does not affect much the quantity demanded due to the low elasticity of demand, this, of course, it's an important advantage that you can exploit.